did not need to break the law to feel afraid. You only needed to live there. Behind the Iron Curtain, fear was not loud. It did not arrive with explosions or sirens. It arrived quietly, embedded in routine. It was present in conversations that stopped abruptly, in doors that closed gently, and in decisions that were never fully explained. Life continued, but it did so under a constant awareness that everything was being observed, evaluated, and remembered. From the outside, the Cold War appeared frozen in speeches, orders, and military standoffs. From the inside, it felt personal. Ordinary people lived inside systems designed not only to control territory, but to shape behavior. What you said, what you avoided saying, who you trusted, and how visible you allowed yourself to become all mattered. Not dramatically, but consistently. Not only nations, but expectations. It taught people how to measure risk in everyday choices. It trained silence as a form of safety. Survival depended less on resistance and more on adaptation. For many, the most unsettling aspect was not repression, but uncertainty. Rules existed, but they were flexible when enforcement demanded it. Loyalty was expected, but never fully confirmed. Normality was permitted, but only within invisible limits. Crossing those limits did not require intent. Sometimes it required only attention. Children grew up learning what not to ask. Adults learned what not to repeat. Humor became coded. Opinions became private. Public life functioned smoothly while private thought withdrew inward. The system did not require constant punishment. It relied on awareness that punishment was possible. This environment produced a particular kind of discipline. People learned to comply without instruction, to censor without command, and to adjust without protest. The absence of chaos was presented as stability. The absence of choice was framed as order. And over time, this framing became familiar. Behind the Iron Curtain, life was not defined by constant terror. It was defined by constant calculation. Every interaction carried weight. Every silence had purpose. People did not ask whether they were free. They asked whether they were safe enough. And that question shaped everything. Daily life behind the Iron Curtain was structured around predictability. Not because the system was transparent, but because predictability reduced risk. People learned to move within narrow boundaries that were rarely written down but widely understood. Stability depended on knowing what was expected and, more importantly, what was not permitted. Public spaces were orderly. Workplaces functioned. Schools operated normally. On the surface, there was little chaos. But beneath this order existed a constant awareness that behavior was being assessed. Surveillance did not need to be visible to be effective. Its power came from uncertainty. Anyone could be listening. Anyone could be reporting. The possibility alone shaped conduct. Conversations followed patterns. Certain topics were avoided entirely. Others were discussed only in trusted circles, and even then with caution. Language became indirect. Meaning was implied rather than stated. Silence often communicated more than words. This was not paranoia. It was adaptation. The state did not need to monitor everyone all the time. It needed only to convince people that monitoring was possible. That possibility altered behavior more efficiently than force ever could. Over time, self-censorship replaced enforcement. People corrected themselves before authority ever needed to intervene. Workplace loyalty carried particular importance. Employment was not merely a source of income. It was a measure of reliability. Advancement depended as much on political conformity as on competence. Mistakes were tolerated. Deviations were not. Personal ambition had to align with approved paths. Individual success existed, but only within defined limits. Travel restrictions reinforced this containment. Movement beyond national borders was rare and heavily regulated. Even internal travel could attract attention. Mobility was treated not as a right, but as a privilege granted conditionally. Distance itself became political. The inability to leave reinforced the sense that life unfolded within a closed system. Information followed similar rules. News was controlled, filtered, and framed. Alternative narratives existed, but accessing them required effort and discretion. Foreign broadcasts were listened to quietly. Printed material circulated discreetly. Knowledge became fragmented, incomplete, and carefully managed. This fragmentation shaped perception. People understood that official narratives were curated, but they also understood the risk of challenging them openly. Skepticism existed privately. Public acceptance was performative. The gap between belief and expression widened steadily. Family life adapted accordingly. Children learned early what subjects belonged at home and which did not. Parents filtered their own speech instinctively. Protection meant preparation. Teaching caution was an act of care. Silence was passed down not as fear, but as wisdom. Despite these constraints, life was not defined solely by repression. People formed relationships, pursued interests, and found moments of meaning. Adaptation did not eliminate humanity. It reshaped it. Joy existed, but it was quieter. Frustration existed, but it was contained. Hope existed, but it was tempered. Behind the Iron Curtain, the system did not aim to crush daily life. It aimed to regulate it. Total control was unnecessary. Consistent limitation was sufficient. The goal was not constant obedience, but reliable predictability. And predictability, once internalized, became difficult to distinguish from choice. This predictability came at a psychological cost that was rarely acknowledged openly. Living within invisible limits required constant adjustment. People learned to observe themselves as carefully as they observed others. Thoughts were filtered before becoming words. Reactions were measured before becoming expressions. Over time, this internal monitoring became habitual. Fear in this environment was not dramatic. It was procedural. It appeared in small decisions made repeatedly, whether to speak or remain silent, whether to trust or remain distant, whether to draw attention or blend into the background. These choices were not made once but continuously, shaping identity through repetition. The presence of authority was subtle but pervasive. Uniforms were visible, but they were not the primary mechanism of control. Files, records, and reputations carried more weight than force. The knowledge that one's past actions could be retrieved, interpreted, and used created a form of discipline that extended indefinitely. Memory itself became a tool of governance. This permanence altered how people related to time. Short-term comfort often outweighed long-term aspiration. Risk was evaluated not by potential reward, but by potential exposure. Change was not resisted out of loyalty, but out of caution. Stability, even if limiting, felt safer than uncertainty. Social trust narrowed accordingly. Close friendships existed, but they were carefully maintained. Political opinions were shared selectively, if at all. Public gatherings were approached with restraint. Collective enthusiasm was rare, not because people lacked conviction, but because conviction carried consequences. Emotional reserve became a form of self-protection. The education system reinforced these patterns. Schools emphasized conformity, reliability, and approved knowledge. Critical thinking existed, but within controlled boundaries. Curiosity was encouraged only insofar as it aligned with accepted narratives. Questioning the system itself was neither expected nor rewarded. Media consumption followed the same logic. Official outlets provided consistency rather than depth. Their role was not to inform fully, but to stabilize perception. Contradictions were smoothed over. Failures were reframed. Successes were amplified selectively. The goal was coherence, not transparency. Yet people were not unaware of these limitations. Awareness did not automatically translate into resistance. It translated into adjustment. Knowing where the edges were allowed individuals to navigate daily life without triggering them. This navigation required attentiveness, not defiance. Humor adapted as well. Jokes became indirect. Satire relied on implication. Laughter provided relief, but it also tested boundaries cautiously. A shared joke could signal trust, but it could also invite risk. Even humor required calibration. This constant calibration produced fatigue. Not physical exhaustion, but cognitive strain. The effort of maintaining awareness, restraint, and alignment consumed attention. Over time, many learned to narrow their focus. Attention shifted toward personal routines, family, and immediate concerns. Broader questions were postponed indefinitely. The system did not eliminate individuality. It constrained its expression. People developed inner lives that remained private and outward behaviors that remained compliant. The division between internal and external self became normalized. Authenticity retreated inward. Behind the Iron Curtain, this division defined daily existence. Life continued not because fear disappeared, but because it became manageable. People learned how to live with limits rather than confront them directly. And in that adaptation, a quiet truth emerged. Control does not require constant force, only consistent presence. This consistent presence of control shaped not only behavior, but perception itself. Over time, many people behind the Iron Curtain stopped measuring their lives against abstract ideals such as freedom or choice. Instead, they measured stability. Predictability became a reference point. If life remained orderly and consequences could be anticipated, the system was considered functional, even if it was restrictive. This recalibration of expectations was subtle and powerful. People did not wake up one day and decide to accept limitation. Acceptance emerged gradually, reinforced by routine. When constraints are constant, resistance feels exhausting, while adaptation feels practical. The system relied on this dynamic. It did not need enthusiasm. It needed compliance without disruption. Scarcity played an important role in reinforcing this mindset. Access to goods, services, and opportunities was uneven and often unpredictable. Long lines, limited selection, and delayed availability became normal. Planning revolved around availability rather than preference. Wanting less reduced frustration. Expecting less reduced disappointment. In this environment, informal networks became essential. Trust was localized. Personal connections compensated for institutional rigidity. Favors replaced efficiency. Relationships mattered more than procedures. Survival often depended on knowing the right people rather than following the right rules. This created resilience, but it also reinforced dependency on closed circles. The state tolerated these informal systems because they relieved pressure without challenging authority. As long as adaptation remained private and fragmented, it posed no threat. The system was not undermined by individual workarounds. It was stabilized by them. People solved problems quietly rather than demanding structural change. Public participation reflected this logic. Official gatherings, elections, and demonstrations followed expected patterns. Participation was visible, but rarely expressive. Attendance mattered more than enthusiasm. Presence signaled alignment. Absence attracted attention. Engagement was performative rather than deliberative. This performance extended to language. Words were chosen carefully. Official phrases were repeated reliably. Deviations were noticeable. Over time, speech adopted a standardized tone in public contexts. Emotional neutrality became a protective layer. Expressing too much passion, even in support, risked unpredictability. Private life offered limited refuge. Homes provided relative safety, but they were not isolated from the system. Walls reduced visibility, not consequence. People spoke more freely indoors, but never completely without caution. The awareness of possible intrusion never fully disappeared. Safety was relative, not absolute. Generational differences began to emerge under these conditions. Those who remembered life before the Iron Curtain carried a sense of loss. Those who grew up within it carried a sense of normality. Memory became uneven. What one generation experienced as restriction, another experienced as baseline. This divergence affected how change was imagined. Older individuals compared the present to a different past. Younger ones compared it only to what they knew. The absence of alternatives limited imagination. Change became abstract rather than practical. It was discussed theoretically, not operationally. The system benefited from this narrowing of imagination. When people cannot easily envision a different structure, they adapt more fully to the existing one. Possibility becomes hypothetical. Risk becomes tangible. The balance favors continuity. Yet even in this environment, tension persisted. It did not disappear. It accumulated quietly. Discontent rarely erupted openly, but it did not dissolve either. It was absorbed into private conversations, personal frustrations, and unspoken expectations. Stability masked pressure, but it did not eliminate it. Behind the Iron Curtain, life was not defined by constant crisis. It was defined by sustained constraint. The system functioned not by overwhelming force, but by shaping what felt reasonable, achievable, and safe. And when reason itself is shaped by limitation, the boundary between necessity and acceptance becomes difficult to see. Over time, the weight of sustained constraint began to shape how people understood responsibility. Choices were evaluated not by personal preference but by potential consequence. Accountability shifted inward. Individuals learned to hold themselves responsible for avoiding trouble rather than pursuing opportunity. Safety became an achievement in itself. This shift altered ambition. Long-term goals were adjusted to fit the system's limits. Careers followed predictable paths. Creative expression was redirected into acceptable forms. Risk-taking, when it occurred, was quiet and calculated. The absence of visible opportunity did not eliminate desire, but it reframed it. Aspiration narrowed rather than disappeared. The system reinforced this narrowing by rewarding reliability. Those who complied consistently experienced fewer disruptions. Stability became currency. Trustworthiness, as defined by conformity, was valued more than initiative. This did not eliminate talent, but it constrained where talent could be expressed. Excellence existed, but it was channeled carefully. Social conformity thus became less about belief and more about survival. People learned to separate internal conviction from external behavior. Public alignment did not necessarily indicate private agreement. This separation was not experienced as hypocrisy. It was experienced as prudence. Authenticity was preserved internally, where it carried no immediate risk. This internalization had lasting psychological effects. When expression is restricted for extended periods, self-definition becomes fragmented. People adapt by compartmentalizing identity. The public self functions smoothly within expectations. The private self remains guarded and incomplete. Over time, this division becomes normalized. The presence of constant evaluation reinforced this division. Files, records, and reputations followed individuals invisibly. Past actions could resurface unexpectedly. Memory was institutionalized. Forgiveness was uncertain. This permanence discouraged deviation. Even minor missteps carried disproportionate weight when recorded indefinitely. The result was a culture of caution. Not silence alone, but careful alignment. People learned to anticipate reaction before acting. They developed an instinct for boundaries without needing explicit instruction. The system succeeded not because it crushed dissent, but because it trained anticipation. This anticipation shaped interpersonal relationships as well. Trust developed slowly and selectively. Shared experience mattered more than shared opinion. Reliability was measured by discretion rather than honesty. The ability to remain silent became a sign of respect. Openness required confidence that could not be assumed. Community life reflected this balance. Social bonds existed, but they were layered. Public friendliness coexisted with private reservation. Collective identity was visible, but individual expression remained contained. Belonging did not require enthusiasm. It required alignment. Despite these constraints, people adapted creatively. Meaning was found in small spaces, family routines, personal projects, quiet achievements. Fulfillment did not disappear. It redefined itself. Happiness was measured in stability, not possibility. Satisfaction came from avoiding disruption rather than pursuing expansion. Yet beneath this adaptation lay an unresolved tension. The constant effort to remain within limits demanded attention. Cognitive energy was spent managing exposure rather than exploring potential. Over time, this created fatigue, not dramatic exhaustion, but a quiet sense of limitation that accumulated gradually. This fatigue rarely translated into immediate resistance. Instead, it expressed itself as withdrawal. Political disengagement increased. Public participation became procedural. People focused inward, reducing the system's pressure by limiting interaction with it. The state remained present, but it became background. Behind the Iron Curtain, this withdrawal was not rebellion. It was coping. The system did not collapse under opposition. It persisted alongside accommodation. People lived within it, not because they believed in it, but because it framed the terms of survival effectively. And as long as survival felt achievable, change remained abstract, distant, and uncertain. As years passed, this quiet withdrawal began to shape the system in unexpected ways. When large portions of society disengage emotionally, authority loses something essential: feedback. The absence of open resistance may look like stability, but it also signals detachment. Compliance continued, but belief thinned. Participation became mechanical rather than committed. This detachment altered how power was exercised. Rules were followed, but enthusiasm was absent. Policies were implemented, but rarely internalized. The system functioned, yet it did so without deep legitimacy. Order was maintained through habit rather than conviction. What sustained it was not loyalty but inertia. Behind the Iron Curtain, inertia became a governing force. Institutions continued operating because stopping them required more effort than maintaining them. Change demanded coordination, trust, and imagination, all of which had been gradually constrained. The system persisted not because it inspired, but because it occupied all available space. This persistence masked fragility. Structures designed to control behavior were effective only as long as people accepted their permanence. When that assumption weakened, the system struggled to adapt. It had optimized for predictability, not flexibility. Stability had been achieved by limiting variation, not by managing transformation. Generational shifts intensified this tension. Younger generations, shaped entirely within the system, understood its rules intuitively, but felt less emotionally invested in its justification. They complied because it was familiar, not because it was convincing. The absence of memory of alternatives reduced fear, but it also reduced reverence. At the same time, exposure to external information increased gradually. Technology, travel, and informal exchange widened perception. Comparisons became unavoidable. What had once been imagined abstractly now appeared concrete. The sense of enclosure became more apparent precisely because it was no longer absolute. This exposure did not immediately produce revolt. It produced comparison. People noticed differences in opportunity, expression, and movement. These observations accumulated quietly. The gap between what was experienced and what was known widened. Discontent grew not as anger, but as awareness. The system responded with caution. Adjustments were made to preserve control without provoking instability. Limited reforms were introduced. Boundaries were softened selectively. The goal was not transformation, but accommodation. Authority attempted to adapt without surrendering its core structure. Yet adaptation proved difficult. A system built to regulate behavior struggled to manage expectation. Once people begin to imagine alternatives, containment becomes more complex. Control based on invisibility loses effectiveness when comparison becomes visible. Silence becomes less persuasive when contrast exists. This shift altered everyday perception. What had once felt inevitable now felt provisional. Rules were still followed, but they were no longer unquestioned. Compliance persisted, but it carried less certainty. The psychological environment began to change before any visible political transformation occurred. Behind the Iron Curtain, the most significant change did not happen in institutions first. It happened in perception. The belief that the system was permanent weakened. The sense that life must always be lived within these limits began to erode quietly. This erosion did not announce itself. It did not appear in mass movements or dramatic confrontations. It appeared in subtle recalculations, in conversations that lasted longer, in questions that were asked more openly, in expectations that expanded incrementally. The system remained intact, but its psychological foundation shifted. What had once been endured as necessity began to feel temporary. Stability no longer felt guaranteed. Continuity no longer felt certain. And when permanence dissolves, even the most controlled systems begin to change. As the sense of permanence weakened, daily life began to change in ways that were difficult to measure but impossible to ignore. The system still existed, but its authority felt less absolute. Rules remained in place, yet their psychological weight diminished. People complied, but with a growing awareness that compliance was a choice shaped by circumstance, not destiny. This shift altered how risk was perceived. Actions that once felt unthinkable became conceivable. Conversations extended slightly beyond their previous limits. Humor became less guarded. Curiosity re-emerged cautiously. These were not acts of rebellion, but signs of recalibration. The internal boundaries that had governed behavior for decades began to loosen. Importantly, this change did not originate from a single event. It emerged from accumulation. Years of adaptation had produced competence, resilience, and awareness. People had learned how the system worked. That knowledge, once used primarily for survival, now enabled comparison. Understanding replaced uncertainty. Familiarity reduced fear. The system struggled to respond because it had been designed to manage obedience, not expectation. Control mechanisms relied on predictability. When predictability eroded, enforcement alone could not restore confidence. Authority without belief became increasingly procedural. The system continued, but it did so on momentum rather than conviction. This transition created an unusual coexistence. Outward order persisted while inward certainty declined. Institutions functioned, but their narratives no longer felt comprehensive. Official explanations sounded rehearsed. Repetition replaced persuasion. The gap between appearance and belief widened. For many, this gap produced a quiet reassessment of identity. People began to consider who they were beyond compliance. Aspirations expanded incrementally. The future became less constrained by habit. Change remained uncertain, but it no longer felt impossible. This psychological transformation preceded visible political change. Before borders shifted or policies collapsed, perception shifted. The Iron Curtain did not weaken first as a structure. It weakened as an assumption. Once its inevitability was questioned internally, its authority diminished externally. Yet this period was not marked by euphoria. It was marked by ambiguity. Freedom was not immediately available. Uncertainty increased. Stability, even if restrictive, had provided clarity. Its erosion introduced risk. Many approached change cautiously, aware that transformation carried its own dangers. The legacy of life behind the Iron Curtain thus became complex. It produced endurance, adaptability, and caution. It shaped generations accustomed to navigating limits. These traits did not disappear with change. They carried forward, influencing how societies adjusted to openness and uncertainty. The system had trained people to survive within boundaries. When those boundaries began to dissolve, survival required a different skill set. Choice replaced predictability. Responsibility replaced compliance. The transition was gradual, uneven, and deeply personal. Life behind the Iron Curtain was not defined by a single moment of collapse. It was defined by a long process of adjustment, first to limitation, then to possibility. The habits formed under constraint did not vanish. They evolved. And in that evolution lies the final truth of life inside closed systems. When control shapes everyday behavior long enough, its effects persist, even after the walls begin to fall. When the Iron Curtain finally ceased to define daily life, its disappearance did not feel like an ending. It felt like an exposure. What had been hidden by routine, caution, and predictability was suddenly visible. People were not only confronted with new freedoms, but with the habits formed under decades of constraint. The system receded, but its imprint remained. Life inside closed societies had trained individuals to navigate limits instinctively. That training did not vanish when limits loosened. Silence did not immediately become speech. Trust did not automatically replace caution. Choice did not instantly feel natural. Freedom required adjustment just as restriction once had. For many, the transition was disorienting. Stability, even when imposed, had provided structure. Its absence introduced uncertainty. Decisions once made by default now demanded responsibility. The burden of choice replaced the comfort of predictability. Not everyone welcomed this shift. Adaptation once again became necessary. The long-term impact of life behind the Iron Curtain was not uniform. Some embraced openness quickly. Others carried restraint forward. Generations shaped by control approached change differently than those raised within it. Memory mattered. Experience mattered. The past did not dissolve simply because conditions changed. This legacy explains why the Cold War did not truly end at the moment borders opened. Its psychological effects persisted. Systems of surveillance, habits of discretion, and expectations of authority continued to influence behavior. The world moved on structurally faster than it did mentally. What life behind the Iron Curtain ultimately reveals is not only how power controls societies, but how societies learn to live within control. Constraint reshapes values, priorities, and perception over time. It does not merely restrict action. It reframes what feels normal, safe, and reasonable. The Cold War is often remembered through leaders, crises, and geopolitical shifts. But its most enduring impact was lived quietly by ordinary people, adapting to systems they did not design and could not easily escape. Their experiences rarely appear in official histories. Yet they shaped entire generations. Behind the Iron Curtain, life was not suspended. It continued. People worked, loved, raised families, and found meaning within limits. The system did not erase humanity. It redirected it. Understanding this is essential to understanding the Cold War itself, because the conflict was not only about ideology or power, it was about how those forces entered everyday life, quietly, persistently, and profoundly. And that is the lasting lesson of life behind closed systems. Walls do not only divide territories, they shape the people who live within them long after they fall.